So welcome back, everyone. I'm Ann Meeker-O'Connell. I am the Director of the Office of Clinical Policy in FDA's Office of the Commissioner. So I will be your moderator for our final session of the day, Next Steps for Implementing Quality Management of Clinical Investigations. So I hope everyone has retained your energy, retained your enthusiasm, because this is where it gets real, where we roll up our sleeves and identify what's next. What are the tangible actions, immediate next steps that the clinical research community can take to incorporate quality management into our clinical studies? Many of you probably know that this is an area of immense passion for me. I have been kind of closely engaged in the quality by design efforts, dating back, I think, to the very first Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative project on the topic. And in case I need to convince you of my commitment, I'll probably note that my car sports a license plate of ICH E8. So, committed, perhaps. But I'm excited by this discussion because I think we have a real opportunity to shift the focus of quality by design from thinking of it as another tool or tools in the toolkit for inspection management to really, and I'm going to steal a word from Ken, an approach to optimizing trial design and optimizing trial delivery. So yes, we can tailor oversight based on what matters, but we can also foster early discussions across functions within a company to break down the barriers that Leslie and others mentioned earlier. And most importantly, we can elevate the patient voice by applying these concepts and really thinking through what are the outcomes that matter to patients most, what are the burdens that sites are facing, and how do we alleviate them. So I'm absolutely delighted to have a fantastic panel here today who will talk about some of the best practices and areas for development. So let me briefly introduce them. So we have Danilo Branco, who is the Director of Central Monitoring at Fortrea, who has over 20 years of experience in RBQM, in central monitoring, project management, and clinical operations, managing complex studies for both big pharma and in CRO settings. We have Michael Torok, who is the Vice President and Global Head of Quality Assurance Programs at Roche Genentech. He has over 25 years of experience in innovating, operating, and quality practices, focusing on harmonizing RBQM practices across sponsors, CROs, and clinical sites. Kelsie Pearson, who's at the end of our row, leads the scientific and network partnerships team for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, Cystic Fibrosis Therapeutic Development Network Coordinating Center, or the CFTDN-CC, if I am actually precision. I'm a recovering quality professional. So she leads the scientific and network strategy for TDN and partners with industry programs on CF clinical trial design, implementation, and thinking about regulatory considerations. And last but not least, we have Peter Stein, who is the Director of the Office of New Drugs in FDA's Center for Drug Evaluation and Research, and O&D provides guidance to industry on a wide variety of clinical, scientific, and regulatory matters, and is responsible for regulatory decisions about marketing approval for new drugs. So really fantastic panel. I'm going to turn it over to each of you to provide some brief opening remarks on what you've heard today and what the next steps that you see are for that are really most important to drive quality by design, drive risk-based monitoring, so that they're closer to becoming standard practice, not something we're talking about in another 5 years is why haven't we implemented. So Danilo, start with you.
Thank you so much. I would like to extend my greatness and my gratitude to the FDA and Duke for this session as we talk about the next steps I think that sessions like these are pivotal to that, right? Where we put a really multidisciplinary team in the same room to discuss, including regulatory agencies, pharma, CRO, site perspective, and patient perspective as well. We heard about all of them today. A few aspects that I would like to mention in my intro. We have heard a lot about enterprise alignment needed for the best adoption, for the way forward. We need to break the silos within our companies, right? Everywhere. We need to stop looking into the ICA GCP as this paragraph belongs to me, the other belongs to other department. We should all have the whole picture, understand that we belong to something really big, and we have our responsibilities in there, we have our roles in there, but we should look to that collectively. Change management, we should be relentless, we should be continuously putting that in place. So today it has been like professionally a day in the paradise to me, because we all, for more that we are coming from different background and different areas, we are all trying to implement best what our big guidance is telling us to do. So we kind of have the same mindset of what we want to accomplish here. But when we get back to our companies, we will face some roadblockers, some reluctance that are natural. They are part of the game. So let's be relentless, because there's a lot of battles to win. There's a lot of things to come, and we need to keep that strong change agents attitude. For very briefly, what I would like to start with next steps, and the first thing that I would like to mention, better storytelling, right? I'm pretty sure that over a decade of adoption, most of us here have good stories to tell. And what is the good case studies to share? And what is the importance of these? Most of you know already the pyramid, the results pyramid, right? Where experience are shaping beliefs, who then trigger actions and then bring the results. The experiences are critical. As we share positive case studies, we'll certainly get some of those more defensive reaction. We'll put them out because we are able to provide good case studies, share some of the histories of success of the adoption, of the methodology adoption. So one encouragement to all of us, let's share these case studies, not hide them for us or internal within our organization. Let's share. My teenager son would be probably proud of me now. Let's make them viral, right? So, yeah. And never lose the focus on the why, right? We are all, and that applies to everyone that we deal day to day in our work day. It's the focus to bring new therapies to those who need it, and we have these why proposing there. There are the how we do that through centralized monitoring, through quality by design, and this is very important, but always keeping in mind the final outcome of our work.
Thank you. So, Michael, perhaps over to you, though I do like the concept of going viral, and I think we should start a hashtag RBQM now. But Michael, go ahead.
Well, thank you, everybody, for the great content so far of this meeting, and thank you to the organizers of the conference. For those of you who know me, RBM, RBQM, QBD, these are like my love languages, and my wife nixed it, but I can't call the kids like CTQ, QBD. No. I thought a lot about what maybe hasn't been said, because I agree so strongly with what everyone's really said. And I started thinking about, how do we cover this execution gap? Sort of my phrase for, I think the guidance is quite clear. What do we need to do? And there's a why to that. To how do we actually do it, and really who? I'm trying to figure out how do we close that. That's part of what is causing the friction for the change, I think. And so I lean very heavy on the culture, right? And I'm a big proponent of critical thinking and open, proactive dialogue. I mean, other love languages of mine. But I started thinking early on when Janet had said new ways of working. And I started thinking, Deming said quality is everyone's responsibility. And as a quality guy, of course, that's my mantra, right? But I started thinking, when I was in operations, would I have agreed with that? When I was in outsourcing, would I have agreed with that? When I worked on the sponsor or CRO sides? And all of a sudden, I started thinking, I don't know that I would have. It wasn't number one. It may not even been number two for me. And I feel like we have an opportunity now to come up with a new persona, a new way of working, where instead of just quality owning quality, it's truly democratized, cross-functionally. And that's, I think, what the ICH E6s and E8 are asking us to do. But that's a shift. And so I've been thinking, how do you do that? And I think the answer for me is, as many folks have said, it's around that training. It's around what does good look like. It's getting down to, on a CTQ basis, what does that mean for the medic or the biomarker scientist or the outsourcing manager? I think there's a big hack there that I think we want to get into a bit. Another thing that I was thinking about during the earlier panels was I think risk proportionality is a gift. I feel like in that zone there's flexibility to critically think, to really get down to what matters. And I think it was Sabrina in the second panel who said, how do we give courage to those roles who at the best of intentions are still holding on to too much? How do we let go of that which is no longer high value or high impact? And I feel like there's a piece there, and in working with leadership at my company and then talking with other leaders across industry, it's sometimes the leaders have to give permission that we're going to actually change the way we're working. And there's a tone from the top that I think is quite important when driving that cultural shift. As employees start to own and use the right tech and critically think and work cross-functionally, I think maybe a tone from above also helps. We're going to make this shift. This is the expectation. Cross-functionally, CTQ focused, anchored in that. And I would even go so far as to say, how do we even anchor that into maybe our performance goals? But I'll maybe pause there.
All right, thank you, Michael. Over to you, Peter.
I feel a little out of place because I have a passion for quality, but I can't say I have a passion for RBM and quality by design as much to the depth of you three. So I'm just awed by your commitment, and thank you for that. I think I'll start because I think we've already heard some passionate arguments for the importance of moving to a greater implementation of quality by design, risk-based monitoring, and the reasons for that, and some of the barriers to achieving that. So I want to sort of step back a second and look at it slightly differently, which is that I started in drug development in industry. Now it's almost 30 years ago, in type 2 diabetes work. And I would say, we pretty much use pretty standard approaches. I mean, we had a certain protocol that was kind of the way diabetes drugs were being developed. And quality by design and risk-based monitoring was not even a term that I think was defined back then, or at least if it was, I must admit I didn't know the definition of it. And the trials were well run. I was working in an organization that had a very good operational and management and site selection processes. But when we think more recently, we think in the last 10 years, we recognize that the types of programs that we're dealing with have really changed. I mean, we aren't dealing with common chronic diseases to the same extent as we were. We're dealing more and more with rare diseases for which there's limited precedent. There's not a protocol that you can take off the shelf and say, this is how I'm going to design this trial for this rare disease. Or we're looking at disease subtypes and we're looking at new platforms. We're looking at different kinds of endpoints. We're looking at a different way that patients interact with program development and with the design of studies. So the environment has dramatically changed. And on top of that, the tools that we have to do work in developing the designs of studies and to implement studies have also changed. I mean, we were talking about decentralized trials, DHTs, which have been around for now many years, but have clearly increased, and our efforts in them have clearly increased. We're looking at, obviously, using real-world data elements in trials. We have, obviously, a much greater IT infrastructure and the ability to look at data streaming from sites and directly from the lab. So the environment has dramatically changed. And I think we have to think about that context as we think about the importance of risk-based monitoring, and in particular quality by design, because when you're looking at the approach to, and I can just go back to my own experience, when I was thinking about doing the next drug for diabetes in the next study, I pretty much looked at what I did before and what sites we used before, how we monitored before, and that worked pretty well. But when we move into new areas, when we move into novel areas or diseases for which there's not precedent, it really increases the critical nature of quality by design, because when you think about it, you really have to start with the end in mind. You have to start with, what are we trying to figure out here? What is the critical information that we need to be able to successfully evaluate this drug? What do we have to achieve with this trial? And the design of the trial needs to be crafted around those questions. What is the critical data? What are the critical issues? What are things that could go wrong, and how do we avoid having them go wrong? What are the safety concerns? How do we monitor for them? How do we assure patient safety? And I think if we start with the kind of the end in mind and apply that kind of framing, our ability to manage the tremendous changes in the environment, I think, is markedly enhanced. So I guess I would say that from my perspective, while quality by design maybe 20 or 30 years ago might be sort of an optional consideration, I think in the current environment, with all of the new tools we have, the different kinds of diseases we're targeting, the different approaches that we can take, I think it becomes much more of an essential. It's really core to being able to be successful in a very changing environment. I think we need to institute that type of thinking so that we are able to run trials efficiently, focus on what matters, and be able to really find things that can help patients. Now, I don't want to sort of make those comments sound like I'm sort of saying, well, in the rare disease or disease subtype site setting, this makes sense, but keep doing what you did before because, gee, that worked. Because really, when you think about it, if you don't start with the end in mind and figure out what are the critical data elements, you're going to run a trial that may work perfectly fine, but will be pretty inefficient and will not be able to really improve both the quality and the efficiency of what we're doing. So I think the story is as compelling for those protocols that are focused on common chronic disease for which there's precedent, but certainly I think absolutely essential as we move into new areas.
So, well spoken. I would almost say said like a quality professional, but then, I think that highlights for me, though, the point that this really isn't about quality as a profession. And so I think the fact that, as you mentioned, we have this kind of cross-functional group all kind of essentially aligning on the same concepts, to me is very valuable. And Kelsie, let me turn to you. I feel like you're so far away.
No, thank you. I'll start by echoing my thanks for letting me participate in the discussion today. I would say Peter stole my opening line of, if you don't feel like an expert, I certainly don't feel like an expert in the terminologies today, and have really learned a lot. But I think my role here is really to bring the patient organization perspective and the clinical trialists and the clinical trial network perspective, and how we think about quality and de-risking studies and ultimately, protecting participants in our trials. And I think a lot of the themes that have been shared throughout the day, I certainly echo that really to implement and incorporate these approaches in a meaningful way, you really do need to engage the patient perspective from the beginning, and not just at the end of protocol finalization or during study operations, but from the early stages of drug development, how do you engage that patient perspective? And I think that patient organizations like the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation and the Michael J. Fox that was talked about earlier are really poised to do that, both in being able to directly engage patients and bring them their voices directly into the conversation with sponsors and CROs and provide their perspective of what's meaningful. But also indirectly, as they, we hear from the community, we listen, they share their experiences, and we can provide those as well. But I think as I think about some forward-thinking thoughts or things that I don't feel like have been brought up today is really where the patient organization can really also build an infrastructure around these approaches that can complement what the sponsor and the CRO and the regulators are doing in this area. And that's something that we think a lot about in the CF space, and particularly our therapeutic development network really is how do we partner with sponsors. So, that starts at the beginning with, opportunities to, the foundation has a program which they, source and have diligence of bringing sponsors into the space and really walk alongside them from the business perspective as well as the scientific perspective. And I think that's where a patient organization can really complement to help de-risk a sponsor because they know the space so well, both scientifically and, from a clinical trial perspective. And provide, consulting. I think that's a huge role for a patient organization to provide just the clinical trials perspective and, and how we kind of see the landscape and the feasibility of being able to conduct a trial in, your disease population. I think a theme that's been brought up as well is just this idea of optimizing clinical trial designs. We think about that a lot. How do we design a protocol in a way that's going to use the fewest amount of patients as possible in order to answer the scientific question, and really kind of pushing on sponsors to feel like they can propose those innovative trial designs to the regulators. That it's okay to think about it a little differently, and not be as conservative because that's really going to improve their feasibility and their chances to fully accrue the study and move forward. I don't know if there's a lot of patient organizations in the audience, but I think another aspect, again, of forward thinking of how you really can think about complementing what the work that the sponsors and CROs is doing is really to build an infrastructure within your kind of clinical trial sites. And so that's something, we have a clinical trial network that was founded in 1998, over 25 years ago, and really putting an emphasis on standardization and quality and training at the site level, starting at the care level, ensuring that there's standardized care that then moves into the research space. We collect metrics on our sites, we provide them back to them for quality improvement opportunities, and I think that just really helps walk alongside the sponsor so that as they're doing their quality improvement and their quality efforts and risk-based monitoring efforts, then that really can then just translate right into a network that's also primed in those approaches as well. So I think it's a collaboration, and I think it's something that it takes an investment on both sides, not just the sponsor and CRO side, but also the patient organization to really ensure that their community and their clinical trial community are ready to conduct these trials in the most efficient and feasible way. So I think those are some of my opening remarks. Thanks.
No, thank you so much, Kelsie. So just as a reminder to our audience, especially those online, we have, you can visit slido.com and enter the code QBD for online submission of questions. So let me actually kick off the discussion with a question that came from our online audience, which is, we've heard throughout the day that, and from different speakers, that quality by design and risk-based quality management principles aren't really new to the industry. Why do you think they haven't been implemented sooner? And I might add on to that, how do we increase use where we see areas in which these concepts haven't been implemented? So I don't know, anyone want to take that first, or Michael?
I can start. I tried to get a little bit at this, and when I opened up, I still think there's this tale of quality owns quality.
Yeah.
Despite the regulations stating otherwise. And so I think that's part of the problem. I think somebody brought up COVID. COVID was obviously a strange, it was horrible in many ways, but a strange way of working. But a lot of teams came together and culturally did something different. I'm not talking about we monitor different. I'm talking like within the team structure, within the walls of an organization. A lot of times there was a big cultural shift. And I know that we saw it at our company where, all of a sudden the silos were just torn down. People got together. We actually talked through stuff almost in real time. I mean, we were on it because it was in a crisis situation. But we all went through that to some degree. And I sort of wonder, how many of our companies went back and actually changed the job descriptions on the back end? Probably not many. And so there was a question, well, why did we revert? And it's also tied into answering this question. It's sort of people regress to the way we've always been working, and that's not optimal. But I think it gets down to change. It gets down to learning. I still see when we talk to some of our service providers or our vendors or work with some of our development partners, we're talking a different lexicon. Even when we talk about what's critical to quality to risk, well, what do you mean by risk? Budget, timeline. No, not those risks. Come back home, we're going to talk about critical to quality risk, to safety, and trial participant protection, and the data reliability. And you're almost in a learning mode and / teaching mode, coaching mode. And Leslie and I sometimes talk about the hierarchy of you can't get the right action you want unless you really understand what you're doing, and you can't really do that unless you're even aware. So it starts with let's drive awareness cross-functionally to make sure that we're working on the same sheet of music. These are the things that matter. This is how we look at them. Perhaps these are the thresholds. This is how we're going to monitor them and pull that through. And I do think it needs to be pulled through into our CROs and our service providers, even into the sites. I mean, I often ask, how oftentimes in our work orders with service providers, as a sponsor, do we even specify what's critical to quality? I'm not so sure I've seen that much out there. But again, that's an opportunity to get us all on one sheet of paper, working in a harmonized way to protect what's CTQ. It's an opportunity. But I feel like there's just a lot of fundamental learning, change to reduce that friction, and maybe coming up with a new way of work.
I can just mention that I think I fully agree. I think there's a level of using the way things were done all along. In my experience in industry, so I'll talk more about that than my regulatory experience. But the saying, never let a good crisis go to waste. I think companies that suffered from some significant quality problems are the ones that I think had a moment in which they had to really look carefully at how they were doing things and change. I worked for a company that 2 years before I joined had really a rather substantial disaster. I won't get into details. That was a huge data integrity issue that had just not been detected for really key endpoints and led to disaster. What that led to was really, I think, a sort of soul searching and a desire to really change how everything was done. And so quality was really part of the team. When we were designing things, quality was really at the table with us and thinking about exactly these kinds of issues. And we designed our trials thinking about what could go wrong and what were the critical elements and what did we have to absolutely assure was done properly. I've been in other companies where that simply was not the way we worked. But I do think that companies have been through major quality problems are more likely to be open to figure out a different way to do things. And I think companies that have done things and not done risk-based monitoring other than just dabbling in it, where they've seen that work, it's very hard to make a course shift without sort of a motivating force that leads to that.
Excellent. I see. Anyone else for that? Because I see we have, I think there's somebody over at the mic. With a question. Yes.
So I wanted to ask a question kind of adjacent to the topic of quality by design. I was wondering how quality by design and stakeholder engagement may increase diversity. of subjects in clinical trials by, reducing the barriers of participation. And so is there current research that can be pointed to in terms of those outcomes, increased accruals of diverse populations, and that could be a compelling argument for the benefit of adopting this approach?
Anyone have a comment or?
I can start with that. First of all, that's a fantastic question. Diversity and inclusion is not by surprise getting more and more part of our daily practice in clinical trials, and it needs to be when the therapy goes outside and start to be selling. We will not target one population alone, right? We will target the world. So it's vital. The quality by design aspect that can be included in terms of, I'm not a physician to tell that, but I think that there is a lot we can do in terms of the inclusion and exclusion criteria to make sure that we bring more diverse population. And just echoing or just repeating myself here, it's very important that we start thinking on those aspects, right, as the methodology implementation.
Maybe I can just add on. I think getting real feedback from the patients that we actually intend to treat with the medicines we're developing is really key. But I think we can even go another level down. I mean, what about study burden for the caregiver, who oftentimes is the one driving or taking off of work? And even site burden. So there's like patient, caregiver, site. And I don't know that I've seen where across the industry we're killing it that way. We need to start to pull this information, mine it, and really think about, well, if we make it so onerous for the patient to come into clinic or their caregivers to take off work, or the situation is such that a DCT sort of convention doesn't work, then we're losing out. And I feel like getting that feedback up front, don't call it a simulation, actually reach out to patient advocacy and advisory groups. I think that's just key. So I think it would absolutely drive certainly feasibility and operational information, but hopefully it's in the patient population that you tend to treat, and that itself should drive or support the driving of more diversity and inclusion in our trials. I think the FDA's guidance on that, and with the action plans that are now, a lot of sponsors are starting to move into that world. So I think we're going to see an uptick there as well.
I mean, I think obviously we've been very interested in pushing for more diversity. It's obviously for a whole variety of reasons that have been spoken about extensively, absolutely critical. And I would say that in a sense, you could look at those diversity action plans as a little bit of quality by design. If we think about what patients in particular are really critical to include in the trial, we want to have diverse populations, but there are certainly certain populations where the disease has a higher prevalence, or where there are particular aspects that we really have to understand the efficacy and safety. And you have to design the program starting from the first parts of site identification with that in mind. So you have to build it into the program, and that's, I think, is really just part of what quality by design is. It's not just the design of this protocol, it's the design of how this protocol is implemented to assure that it meets its objectives, and the objectives of assuring appropriate diversity and experience across different populations should be part of what we're all seeking as we implement trials.
And I might just comment that, if we go back to ICH E8 and kind of the quality by design publications that talk about engaging the variety of parties who may have an interest in kind of a trial at the time of design, to really make sure that the perspectives and experiences, particularly of patients, are and their caregivers, are incorporated. So Kelsie, I might ask you if there are any particular approaches that you see kind of critical as to ensuring the patient perspective is included, because I think that's one way we can optimize trial design.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of approaches that you can take, some of which have been talked about, as far as advisory boards, focus groups, surveying the community. I think that really, someone brought up the why. I think that's really crucial for the population that you're directing your therapies to. I mean, a lot of what has to be in a protocol and the balance that the sponsor has to consider with the regulatory considerations and other, if you just really help a patient really understand, like, why does the drug have to be dosed at that frequency? Why does it have to be done in this way? That helps them be more engaged in the work that you're doing, but also get creative and thinking, okay, because that is the reality, how would I then participate in this trial? What are my ideas for you as a sponsor to do that? And I loved I think it was Ada who brought up the fact that they're considering the whole person's as they participate in trial and thinking about, care of their animals or transportation, and we're working in childcare into our guidance for sponsors and thinking about that. And so I think hearing from that perspective as well, I think what was just said is that your population can't be an afterthought. You really have to bring them in at the beginning as you think about your whole program and how you're going to implement this, because ultimately if they can't enroll for whatever reason, then it's not, all of your efforts are not worth anything at the end of the day.
I think we have a question. We have a couple
Maybe
people.
two. I think.
All right.
Good afternoon. Thank you for your presentation. I'm on this side of the room for the sake of diversity. So my name is Melva Covington. I'm the founder and the managing director of a research firm, small business. It's called Agape Strategic Solutions, as well as a co-founder of an engagement and technology company that's looking not only to integrate this concept of engagement, but scale it using AI technologies. The reason why I think I'm here is to really understand the extent to which we can not only embed the concept of inclusion in our work to the extent that we are focused on the mission of reducing disparities in outcomes. That's the lens in which we do research, engagement, and tech solutions in everything that we do. So my question is, the two questions. The first question is, and we start throughout the entire process, it's systems oriented. Even before you have a product, we're working with companies to really understand populations, understand barriers, understand issues, understand the dynamics that are impacting a variety of different communities, so that when you then start your compound and when you're working, it's not an aha surprise, but you've been working through the process. So to that effect, first question is the extent to which you embed satisfaction into your quality measures. Right? Satisfaction of the patient, satisfaction of the processes into quality and understanding that as it relates to building your QTC. The other is, to what extent do you think your companies are interested really in working with these smaller organizations that are innovative, that are scrappy, that are not like the big companies that are doing this? And do you see that there is an interest really in thinking outside of the box with many companies like my own that are trying to just think about things differently? A lot of questions in there, but any aspect of it, I'd appreciate it. And thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. So I'm curious, are we measuring, essentially, I think we talked about it a little bit earlier, customer satisfaction in terms of thinking of participants as one customer from a quality perspective or satisfaction?
I mentioned these on the why, right?
Yeah.
To not forget about that, not lose the focus on the patients, right? And the intention here is that we are, all of us, very busy, right? With a lot of work to do every day, that we may be tempted to just get the work done. And there is a call to think before act right here. When we think about the main purpose of why we wake up every day and put our best for several hours in the day, and they are the patients, that will come naturally, the satisfaction. And when we sit in like 2, 3, 4, whatever amount of meetings to discuss the initial risk assessment for a trial in a cross-functional capacity, if we have that in mind, that will naturally come as well. The patient, the dissatisfaction will come as well as part of that, instead of just, looking for my area of expertise, in this case, centralized monitoring. How I will centralize monitor the data on this study. Actually, if I put that in mind, that how can centralized monitoring bring the quality and bring the results that I want to achieve with the patients in mind. So, yeah.
So I think we'll come back to the other mic.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, and thank you for the great discussion. Sort of keying off of the concept of quality by design in the setting of rare diseases in particular, as well as the patient community's contribution to that. We have been working in an ultra-rare disease called Barth syndrome, where we did do everything we could for quality by design in terms of talking to the patient group, understanding the endpoints that had been well established in natural history. But I think when it's a first try in a disease that nothing's ever been tried in before, there's elements you can't quite control for. In our case, it was duration of therapy, leading us to a situation where you had used all the patients and you had uncontrolled data in open label that was looking promising. We did turn to the natural history, and that's really where my question comes in. So one group we were working with had done an excellent and very detailed, rigorous natural history study. But when we started to look beyond that, right, to get more data on imaging endpoints like cardiac endpoints, that's where I think we started to see, looking more broadly at other groups around the world that had collected these data, a lot of, was it 2D echo or was it 3D echo? Did they have patient level, medication or ConMed information? How frequently was it entered? I'm curious how much the concept of quality is brought into and educated, frankly, to patient groups as they're doing a lot of work, particularly in rare and ultra rare, to establish the natural history. Because for these data to be useful from a regulatory perspective, I think that quality element becomes pretty essential. So just curious your thoughts on that.
I can start a little bit. It's a really good point and a really good question with this, the cystic fibrosis space, which is the rare disease. We're fortunate to have a really robust registry, which really has been a great resource over the last, 4 decades to provide kind of the natural history of CF, and then there's a lot of kind of investigator-initiated studies that have been paired alongside that as the disease landscape has changed, as drug approvals have occurred. To really understand what that looks like. But I will say that we are entering into our first kind of foray of developing a little, I don't know if natural history is the exact terminology for the study, but we're really trying to think about a study that would provide external control data for sponsors trying to develop drugs in CF when there just aren't going to be the numbers to allow for a large placebo group, and really needing to have that external control. So we're gearing up a study, and really we've partnered with industry to design that study. What are the endpoints that we need to be collecting? What kind of safety monitoring do we need to be doing in order to then allow that data to be useful to the sponsors? And then we're also partnering actually with the Critical Path Institute and using their rare disease cure accelerator platform as a platform to be able to share some of that data, hopefully, with sponsors, both in their drug development planning, but also perhaps to support some of their regulatory submissions to do some of the analyses around some shared placebo groups. So it's definitely new territory for us, but it's definitely had to have been a collaboration with industry for those reasons, to ensure that it's done in a manner that's really, putting quality at the first and foremost.
That's great feedback.
I think it's a great question. It's an absolutely critical issue. I mean, I commented before on rare diseases, and as I said previously, it's really challenging because there's so much we don't know. There's not a protocol out there. There's not often endpoints that are well developed. We don't really understand the natural history. We don't really understand the heterogeneity of the disease. And when you're talking about diseases that are heterogeneous, where the endpoints aren't all that clear, and where the populations are small, you really do have to start with critically high-quality information that you can rely on to design trials. And when you don't have that information, the outcomes, if you have a positive outcome, you're lucky. But that's a situation which we really, I think, have to think very carefully about and invest a lot in to avoid situations where we run a trial and we don't get clarity of an answer. I think for patients, we either need to find out that a drug doesn't work or that it works, but getting a gray zone answer is really a problem. And it happens when we don't have good quality information that inform the design of the trial. This is an area we've had a lot of focus on. And we've collaborated with the CPATH Institute to try to support registries and accumulation of data from different rare diseases. We have a number of guidances to talk about how one thinks about natural history studies. We've had grants to support natural history studies. As I said, we have a new program, the ARC program, Accelerating Rare Diseases Cures, with an educational piece that focuses on a range of things, including working with patient groups to make sure they understand the rules of natural history studies. So this could be an entire discussion in and of itself, but I could only underline what you said, which is that assuring that patient groups, when they're able and interested and committed to developing natural history studies, are partnering and have the right information to know how to make sure it's structured, the right things are collected, it's rigorous, and it really can inform all of the potential uses, which are helping to define endpoints, understanding the natural history, in some situations being an external control group. If that data is not high quality, it serves none of those purposes, and it's frustrating for everybody. It's frustrating for patient groups, certainly. It's frustrating for families. It's frustrating for companies, and it's very frustrating for regulators as well.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So maybe we could shift to thinking about, we've talked a little bit about where the challenges are. I'm interested in your perspective on where you've seen kind of the most effective implementation of quality by design or risk-based approaches, and what was it about them that made them effective?
I can jump in. Again, getting to culture, getting to, are people even aware so that they can actually understand what to do, so that we can actually get our BQM practices sort of animated and lived, and this is how we go about our work in a cross-functional way. I would say a lot of the focus has been there. So it's aligning on language, basic learning, vocabulary. When we talk about this is what we mean. And every function around the table and our CRO and vendor partners all sort of agree. There's a full alignment. That's a best practice. Like you start to, very quickly, it's amazing. Like if we asked everybody in this room, define risk, or if we gave you a protocol, we would not be on the same page. And that's just the reality of it. So how do you start to cut through that? And I think it's an alignment activity. So that's one thing to do. I think some organizations use like a RACT, like a risk assessment categorization tool. These have been out in industry for a while. We do. And it's like this tool to harmonize. You know, whether you love the RACT or not, whether you think it's, this or it's too cumbersome, getting everybody around the table to agree on the risks and start to actually assess them and think about detectability and impact and the likelihood, like you start to see light bulbs come on in the cross-functional way. And you've just started to align and get that harmonized working team. And so that's a best practice. At Roche, we've gone the next step and we've tried to centralize a little bit of this with a big asterisk. We don't want to just own it. We want to make sure that we drive change across the functions. And so we have a group that actually drives that change, the learning, the training, the updating, pulling together the data so that we can mine it, and actually trying to drive knowledge management towards continuous improvement. That came up earlier, and I just had a quick comment there. We certainly want to action our risks, right? Especially if they become issues. But sometimes those issues aren't actually pulled through to the rest of the clinical portfolio. You might have an issue actually occurs. That may be a very valid risk across 10%, 20% of the rest of your portfolio if you're using maybe the same vendor or two. So this loop truly exists. But by having a center that drives all those change management pieces, shows people what good looks like, and then pulls it through towards learning is a bit of a hack that we're working through. Now we recognize we don't want people to say, well, they've got it, we're not going to bother. So there's probably a bit of an extinction coefficient on that group because we want everybody to really own this and make it their ways of working, that it's just natural. So those are some hacks that we're working through now, but we've had quite a bit of progress because of that. But they're basics in learning and change management. I mean, fundamentals. Different topic, but fundamentals.
Perhaps we'll go to the mic. We have a small line forming.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you very much for your sharing your knowledge and expertise in the field. My name is Dr. Lester Jao Lacorte. I'm a medical officer and IRB chair for a military treatment facility. So from my perspective, I would like to also represent and convey to you some issues that principal investigators who are also involved in the equation of implementing clinical trials along with sponsors, industry, and patients. From the perspective of PIs, and I would like to ask about your perspective on promoting principal investigator engagement where we want to provide greater innovation in clinical trials, but at the same time, PIs also find that and are discouraged that some things that you may be proposing in quality by design also increases the regulatory burden that they perceive and also experience in trying to provide clinical care, standard of care, good clinical practice guidelines into patients, but also bring them into the fold of the diversity of clinical trials, where research is not the same as clinical care. So I deal with that in a military treatment facility and the Department of Defense, but it also applies to the entire spectrum of clinical trials, regardless of where you apply them, whether they be, of course, the commercial arena enterprise or the military treatment facility. So I just really wanted to get your view on how do you loop in PIs to say, we don't want to comply with all of your regulations. And I've worked for FDA also for like 15 years, so I understand. But as an IRB, what would you suggest I tell PIs that research is necessary even though FDA doesn't regulate practice of medicine?
Anyone want to start? I mean, when you kind of had mentioned kind of the kind of role of the clinical investigator in the context of quality by design, as it was kind of envisioned from when we were building out this concept in the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, the clinical investigator was actually one of the central parties that we thought should be engaged in early discussions at the time of trial design. That actually, there's a value in the insights of somebody who's going to be implementing a trial, where, as if you say the trial is where the rubber hits the road, those are the people that are going to be able to tell you how this particular design, which seems grand and elegant in isolation, breaks down when it kind of hits the delivery of care. And so to me, that's one way of engaging investigators and actually optimizing the design by kind of taking that input. I read a lot about, and I'm interested in your perspective as well on kind of sites, about the challenges that investigators, their staff face because we haven't thought through some of that here's the trial, here's all the tools and the new DHTs that we've introduced that are a benefit, but we've kind of forgotten a little bit about thinking about it from the site perspectives. Curious if that's something that you guys have experienced as well.
I want to share a couple thoughts about these. The first one is to highlight again the importance of this kind of event, right? We are giving opportunity and voice to the entire community in clinical trials. So I appreciate very much the question and hope that we'll continue doing these event for the future. About the quality by design and central monitoring or BQM implementation and the need of having the site perspective as well. I think that it has been very important in the way that we implement the concept on the day-to-day activities and giving the confidence to the site staff. I mean, communication will be key here in the change management because it's about giving the confidence to the site staff that we are actually improving or promoting a better data oversight for their population, for the study population in general. Sometimes, and this is one question that I have heard quite frequently, is you are reducing the time of your representative, your CRA on site, so I'm lacking the oversight from your team. It's actually all the other way around. We are increasing the oversight on the data with the new methodologies. We are working much closer to the data and being able to identify the risks much earlier than before. So those couple aspects.
When we think about risk assessment, it really has to start at the site level. That's where the trial is actually going to go right or go wrong. I mean, we think about what procedures might not go off the way we wrote them in the protocol, or what kind of reporting things we want reported and when. But we have to understand what can be done at the sites. What are the things that would interfere with it getting done in the way the protocol was to be designed. That type of input and feedback at the design stage is absolutely essential. I mean, meeting with investigators, having them review the protocol, having them review what the expectations to the site are, and getting the feedback on this is going to pose a problem, that becomes an item of risk. And if you can't change it, then you have to make sure that you're monitoring it very carefully because you already know that that might not go the way you want to. So if you don't understand sort of what the site perspective is, and also adjust the protocol where you can to assure that it is implementable, then I don't think you're really embracing quality by design.
Yeah. I think we have one last question over at the...
Thank you. Great panel discussion. Thank you. Speaking of IRBs and ethics committees and sort of bringing them along with the journey, how much work you think it needs to be done, speaking of not working in silos, so that they can be brought up in all the concepts and nuances of quality by design, so that they are not becoming a barrier in protocol approval and so forth. Thank you.
Anyone have thoughts on that?
I mean, I can jump in. I have a bit of a fantasy of full transparent risk-based quality management, inclusive of CTQs, quality by design, RBM, effective and prompt issue management, and then the storytelling part that Danilo said, kind of telling the story at the end of the day. I think if we can sort of line it up, again, I find it quite logical. One sort of begets the next. You can't really have a great monitoring plan if you don't even know what you're monitoring. But I think maybe transparently providing that could be in protocol, could be in some order of other communications out to different stakeholders depending on who you're talking about, all the way through to you could use something like that that could actually help you score your inspection readiness at the end of the day. Again, it's all logical in terms of a sequence. I don't know if we're doing that, to be honest, but I think there's an opportunity to just be very clear up front. Here's what we're saying is worth protecting. Here's how we've assessed the risk against that. Here's our plan on how we're going to monitor it and mitigate it, and maybe we were able to eliminate these risks. These risks persisted, and so I feel like there's an opportunity to be more transparent about that. And again, pull that through to sites, pull that through to your CROs and your different development partners. I think transparency is like the mother of mitigation.
Excellent. So I think we have about a minute left, and I have a very brief lightning round question for each of you, which is one of my colleagues in my office has a magic wand, so that she pulls out occasionally during meetings. If I gave each of you Janet's magic wand, what would you change or implement? The one thing you do to promote these concepts. So just first thing that comes to mind. I'll maybe start with Kelsie because
Magic wand. I would just say like additional or more collaboration up front at the very beginning between all of the stakeholders, I think, to be able to set the program on the right track.
I think it's organizational alignment and leadership investment in getting this done. I think this is not something that's just going to be, ground up. This has to be ground up interest and leadership implementation. And it's resource intensive. It can take longer to design trials when you're doing it this way. And so there needs to be commitment. And if that's not there in the organization, but just one person waving a flag is just not going to go anywhere, which is where we are now, unfortunately, which is that this really hasn't been implemented the way it could be. And so without organizational commitment and resources allocated, it still won't happen.
I mean, my initial gut reaction is people feel comfortable enough hitting the timeout button to actually think. But I think the real answer for me is probably around data harmonization. I feel like once the culture shifts and all the team members come together and they're sitting around the table and they're looking at disparate data sets that maybe aren't normalized and they're not linked so you can understand the relationship, there's going to now be another bottleneck. Well, how do we understand what this means? What is this telling us? And so I think some of the more technical data-related presentations, I just kind of geek out on that. I'm thrilled because I see the work going on there. But I think that's two things. Think, and then have the data to actually inform your decisions and give you something to actually critically think about when you come together to do it.
I would add, not add because it was said, but I would mention collaboration and synergy. We did a great job in front of the size of the monster with COVID, right? Dealing with the crisis and implementing innovative approach, out-of-box approaches. And we somehow stopped it when COVID terminated or the pandemic terminated. And there wasn't good lessons learned. So it shows us that in front of a crisis, we are able to think collaboratively, to be all together, and take in consideration cross-functional ideas and actions, and we need to keep pursuing that.
Right. Excellent. Well, I want to thank all four of you for an excellent discussion. Thanks to the audience for all of your questions online and in the room. At this point, I will turn it over to Marianne Hamilton-Lopez, who is a Senior Director of Biomedical Innovation and core faculty at Duke Margolis, for some concluding remarks. But thank you very much. Great discussion.
wait till the very end that it all falls apart. All right. Well, thank you, Anne. That was great, a great panel. We've heard a lot of really great initiatives today that are really aimed at advancing quality management in clinical studies through application of QBD, and RBM principles. As we think about increasing adoption of these principles in clinical trial design and conduct, it is my pleasure to summarize some of the information from today. So we kicked off with opening remarks from Dr. Janet Woodcock, starting with the big catalyzing moments of the quality by design in clinical trials evolution, referencing the initial borrowing of acronyms and concepts from manufacturing industries. Dr. Woodcock also spoke about early risk-based monitoring efforts, and both are critical for facilitating clinical trial modernization by enhancing efficiency without compromising data integrity or participant protections. And a side note, congratulations again to Dr. Woodcock for her well-earned retirement. We just want to express our gratitude for everything that she has done in a career in service of public health. So next we had Dr. Jacqueline Corrigan-Curie then led a session where we heard presentations from career regulatory leaders on the critical guidance documents and supporting regulatory efforts that are going to drive adoption of these key principles. That session was joined by pharma and FPA industry sponsor representatives on the E6 and E8 working groups, who began setting the stage for organizations' operational, technical, and cultural necessities for advancing critical applications. Key guidance documents were presented at a high level with the overarching message that all participant guidance documents are not sufficient for implementation of QBD and RBN approaches. Additionally, the panel conveyed that it takes many different stakeholders in change management in order to make any of this possible. Session 2 was our first deep dive into how successful we've been in driving QBD implementation, as well as to provide a teaser to RBM insights. Quite fitting to have that moderated by Citi's newly appointed executive director, Morgan Hanger, knowing that it was Citi's seminal quality by design efforts that brought many of these principles to life over a decade ago. We heard good news, not so good news, as we knew would be the case, frankly the latter being the reason that FDA felt this workshop was important and necessary. Detailed data was presented from Tufts Center for the Study of Drug Development before hearing of case studies, successes, lessons learned, and remaining challenges from sponsors, CRO, and patient advocacy representatives. A few things are clear. Integrating these modernizing quality design principles is feasible, but requires thoughtful and sustained effort. Devoted leadership, cross-staff buy-in, adequate and continued training, infrastructure develop that truly embeds these quality and risk management practices are all required for any kind of significant organizational cultural change. We also learned that there is room for alignment on different viewpoints on implementation of QBD and successful implementation on the need and value of involving patient input early into the designed process. The third session focused on the exacting data and use case examples that highlighted where RBM and RBQM adoption is firmly nestled into practice and where we have a way to go. The need for clear lines of communication was discussed in order to raise awareness of QBD and how it can translate into ongoing risk proportionate monitoring efforts, and that overthinking can cause issues. Flexibility in an organization it was needed to both respond in a dynamic environment and to nimbly work with third-party vendors to align on monitoring strategies. There's still a lot of work in progress. Important to recall that manufacturing is ahead in adoption of QBD and working within existing regulatory frameworks, but there's opportunity for improvement. Other key recommendations included effectively managing risk and considering the role of third-party service providers and how advanced statistical tools and also AI are contributing to RBM advancements. Finally, we ended the day with a panel discussion from a range of expert stakeholders tasked with tying together lessons for the day, highlighting issues that may not have come up, and help to chart the way forward. They also called for everything to go viral. Insights included that there's wider implementation of QBD and RBM, and it requires thoughtful reflection on why these approaches matter to each stakeholder and how we can achieve buy-in from patients. Also, the benefits of wider spread adoption have the potential not just to assure quality in clinical development, but may also facilitate increased patient enrollment and recruitment. Going back to our objective of the day, it is our hope that many in the clinical trial community will feel empowered to utilize the learnings, the tools, and the confidence to increase adoption of these approaches in future clinical trials. Before we go, I'd like to take a moment to thank everyone who contributed to this excellent workshop. First of all, the speakers and panelists who continue to do great work in the space and who took the time to share their expertise with us over the course of this workshop. Thank you to all of our colleagues on FDA's planning team for this workshop, including the Office of Medical Policy and CEDAR, and to their leadership, including Dr. Kare Elzarad. We appreciate the efforts of many others at FDA who have contributed to the planning process. And a big thank you to our team at Duke Margolis for their role in planning the event and for providing their expertise throughout the process, and as well as to the staff at the National Press Club for helping the event run smoothly. Finally, I'd like to thank all of you within the audience. Thank you for joining us for this workshop, and have a great rest of your day.